We are set and we are
I've
now,
gotten the notice the meeting is now streaming.
we are set.
Okay. So I'll call the meeting of the South Orange Town Central School District, January 25th Board of Education meeting to order at 7:36 p.m. It's a video conference, and I can see that I am present, Mr. Lamadrid is present, Mr. Henry is present, Miss Lee is present, and Dr. Stepanian is present. Can we rise and do the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation,
under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So I'm just going to say that everybody's video is frozen. So I assume you're still there, even though you're not moving. But everybody can hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. All right. Are there any board announcements?
None from Tom.
Do we have any committee reports?
Lonnie, we had
I know that audit finance. Go ahead, Dan.
we had audit council to interview claims auditors. There's going to be a follow-up meeting tomorrow. But at this point, there's no recommendation. So after tomorrow's meeting, we should have a good discussion and bring back to the board a recommendation on acceptance of a claims auditor.
Okay.
We also had a policy.
Any other committee reports?
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello? You can hear me. Okay. We also
Yes, I
had
hear
a
you fine.
okay.
That's
We
fine.
also had a
Ms. I hear
policy.
you fine.
Okay. We also had a policy meeting back on the 13th. Reviewed, I think, about 5 different policies. There's one I know on the agenda today about data retention. Some of the others are still going through some of the reviews. So that's that with that committee. Would you also like a download from the legislature at this time? The legislature's webinar? That was a couple of weeks ago. So we had actually good representation from all the legislators. As you probably all know, for our district, we have a new Assemblyman, Mike Lawler, as well as a new State Senator, Elijah Recklin Melnick, and they were both present. We didn't have anybody from the federal government, but I do know that the Rockland County School Board had a chance to meet with Mondaire Jones. But really, the topic of the discussion was around COVID advocacy. And this was, of course, we wanted to get it in before the state budget vote. So, of course, we know that there's been some updates since then. Wanted to give them kind of a state of, what was happening among all the districts based on, COVID, how we've been hit financially and how potential budget cuts will really impact our district. There were areas that we did advocate for, specifically around, how we can get some relief, maybe eliminate or reducing state testing to help some of our districts, particularly with some of the focus, a lot of resources being focused on COVID and managing COVID. Request about the tax levy cap growth rate to set that at 2% and at a floor tax cap calculation of 0, so the districts won't have to be faced with a negative tax levy cap. Also, we asked all the state legislators to advocate at the federal level, particularly around more state aid in order to make some, not impact the school budget so much. We also talked about reinstating SALT, the state and local tax that was taken out, boy, what was that, 3 years ago with the tax reform at the federal government level. We also talked about the regional cost index and asking that that be in par with New York City and Long Island. So we actually said, advocated for both Rockland and Westchester County to be in line with, you know, those New York City and Long Island, which has a higher regional cost index. We also talked about transportation aid. Of course, there's been a new update on transportation aid, and we did get some relief, but again, we wanted to advocate to have more state aid so we can be made whole on that. And we also asked for some kind of out-of-the-box thinking around transportation. We had asked the legislators to consider legislation to reduce the transportation requirement for districts from 15 miles to 10 or 5 miles, and we gave them the potential savings if something like that was implemented. So I think that was that. There were some discussion, some information that the legislators gave us as far as the impact to COVID. There's a $15 billion deficit this year, primarily due to COVID. They talked about some cuts and potential impact due to cuts, as well as some revenue increasing opportunities. They talked about a millionaire's tax. So I know you're probably all up to date on what's been happening since the 11th. So that's what happened at the legislators meeting.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. I was dropped by the internet and missed some of the beginning of your report. But are there any other committee reports? Okay. Going on, we have two policies for review. The mission statement I would like to table. And we have the school district's records, the first reading. So that's basically just a public first reading. If anybody has any comments to it or questions, they can email Miss Lee or Miss Muscari, and then we can discuss those comments. Or if no one has any comments, we can put it on the agenda at a future meeting for a second reading
So
and possible adoption.
Lonnie, you want questions to be
Yep.
emailed in?
Yeah, I think that's probably the easiest way to either mark up the PDF or send in the questions on the policy.
Okay, we'll do.
Let me ask you a question with regard to the school district records policy, Dan. Is that something that we should run past the audit committee?
That was,
Just because I know we've done some work there with risk assessments and so forth.
yeah, that was one of my questions, Lonnie. I was curious, I mean, you know, who is the records management officer? And then I think there's a couple other considerations in light of audit risk and things like that.
All right, so I guess we'll look at your comments, and then based upon your comments, we'll take it to the audit committee. Does that work? Okay. Does anybody else have any comments regarding the policy offhand, or are we good to email them? I see head nods. Okay. All right, moving along on the agenda. We have the consent agenda. So can I have a motion to approve the consent agenda items 6 through 10?
Make a motion.
Second.
Any questions? I have one question on the consent agenda. On the acceptance of minutes, item 10, it speaks of the South Orange Town Central School District Board of Education meeting / workshop agenda. But the workshop doesn't have minutes. So shouldn't it just be minutes of the Board of Education meeting?
Yeah, I'll change that. I also just realized that December 22nd, it should be 2020 for the special meeting.
In the description under B, right now it reads January 25th, 2021. That should read December
No, down
22nd.
in the recommended action under B, under 10B, well, 10A and 10B, the year should
Yes.
be 2020.
It does say that.
It says 2021.
No, but the months are off also. So for 10A, right, it currently reads the January 25th, 2021 South Orange Town Central School Day, right? That should read December 15th, 2020.
No, that's listing what this meeting is. That's listing the January 25th. That's under, if you look at like 9, it's listed there as well, January 25th.
Okay. All right. Oh, I see what you're saying now. You're under the recommended action, it says 2021, it should be 2020.
Right.
Gotcha. Do the other board members see that?
I do, but I actually have a question. Aren't the workshops, though, we still have a meeting beforehand and there's still items that we do approve? And I did see the meeting minutes, it does list that basically then, after we did that, we went to a workshop. So I thought it had to be approved. I thought it had to be put in record.
But the minutes only represent the board meeting. They
Right.
don't represent the work.
Oh, I
So
see
that-
what
so
you
that's
mean.
why I'm
Yes,
saying that-
I got
So
it.
as far as the description should read, it should just read the South Orange Town Central School District Board of Education meeting, period.
Okay.
Okay? Okay.
Got it.
And so that is the same for A and B.
Okay.
And then we'll fix the year in the recommended action.
Yep.
Right? So then, can I have a vote for the revised consent agenda as we just discussed? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I lost you, Dan.
Aye.
Okay. Okay. Is there any new business for this evening? I see none. Can I have a motion to adjourn a motion to adjourn to a Board of Education workshop on strategic planning and long-range financial planning at 7:50?
Make a motion.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay. So that ends the board meeting, and we're now set for the board workshop.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. And I just want to say, for the sake of full transparency, if you do see me checking my cell phone periodically, it's really all related to communications issues. And I know we've been dropping phone calls and, some of the Wi-Fi issues. So I just, for the folks who are watching at home, I just want you to know that most everything, I would say everything that we're, again, for open meetings law, if you see me checking my texts, it's just because it's more for the sake of the communication aspect of the remote meeting tonight. So Board of Education, we essentially have two overarching topics to discuss that are interrelated. We find that the timing is really very important as it relates to finance, and connected to that, we're going to get some critical feedback from you, critical input, I should say, regarding a continuation of our conversation about selecting scope for summer 2022 summer work. And the first item that we're going to be presenting to you as part of a discussion protocol is recent, and I say recent within the past week, as it relates to the governor's budget. Everything that we're going to talk about tonight connects to every other topic. So we could really go down the rabbit hole tonight, having conversations about what could be a very complex topic. And we will have those conversations. We're just not going to have them all tonight. So we want to be mindful of time because these could be topics that could go on all night. And I know none of us want to do that. However, I do believe it's going to establish a framework for the work that we're going to be doing going forward. So we want to start this evening with a cursory introduction to some of the financial aspects or elements of this year's budget, specifically connected to the governor's budget last week as it relates to revenue. We have some other aspects as it relates to property tax cap restrictions, as well as sort of some assumptions that we've made connected to some reserve strategies that we would hope to use going forward, and then certainly some assumptions we've made as they relate to expenditures. And again, just again to provide a broad framework for budget development going forward. You should have gotten some of this, or you should have gotten all of this actually last Friday. So what I would like to do, at least for the first, I'm going to say 15 to 20 minutes. It looks like we're doing pretty well on time here. I want to introduce Mrs. Coster to go through the summary that we sent to you last Friday. And Mrs. Coster does have the ability to share the screen. Oh, there you go. She's reading my mind. So we're going to go through this, spend some time on it, get some feedback, knowing that we are going to have a finance committee tomorrow night. So whatever questions that you would like to bring into the public domain, that would be helpful tonight, and that we could continue to address tomorrow evening as part of our finance committee subcommittee. So Mrs. Coster, I see that you've put up the presentation. What I would like to do now is turn this over to you. And again, like I said, we're going to spend probably no more than 20 minutes on this because we also want to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about summer 2022 capital project work. So Mrs. Coster, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Pritchard, and good evening, everyone, cabinet and board members alike. As Bob mentioned, the materials that we're going to go over this evening were in the board packet, and it may be a little bit easier to read. I apologize if some of these slides may look a little small on the screen. So again, I like to start out, and we've used this sheet for many years, which really shows our projection out for next year, as well as the outer 3 years beyond that. And starting off, taking into consideration the first executive proposal from last week, and I'll just touch upon it. I know I had put quite a bit of information in the board report last Friday. Our state aid projection is based off of the first governor's executive proposal for January. We know that he'll come out usually with a secondary one, usually late March, right before the state adopts their budget in time for an April 1st deadline. This year, as Ms. Lee had mentioned previously, the governor's budget reflects almost a $15 billion deficit, and they're hoping to get some of those monies recouped from the federal government through the stimulus funds that are being discussed presently with the Biden administration. So the state budget that came out in terms of the executive runs were based on and reliant upon that the state received at least $6 billion in federal monies to support this picture that the governor presented last week. So taking into consideration the executive proposal amongst other factors, we arrive at our projections. And I'll just go over that in a minute. And we do use several indicators. We use previous budgets. We use actual receipt of aid. How close year to year did we come from the projected to what we actually received? And then just using our experience, knowing that how close the governor usually comes into the state budget of what they originally projected. And this year, seeing also, once again, the proposal to collapse down our 11 expense-based categories into a single aid category. So we analyze that again a little further to start with this long-range financial plan, one, to see what the impact would be if these aid categories were collapsed. But in previous years, how close did we come to our projection in actual receipt? Somewhat dissecting the governor's executive proposal a little bit deeper to make apples to apples comparisons. So when you look at this chart, on the top, we have our revenues, and you'll see that we have next to the first green column our adopted budget for 2021. So that begins with the property tax cap on top. That was our adopted property tax cap for 2021. And then you'll see our budgeted revenues below that, which amounts to a $96.8 million budget. We know that in school district budgets, our revenues must equal our expenses. We must present a balanced budget to our public for vote and make sure that we maintain a balanced budget through the end of the fiscal year. The next column goes through, based on what we know today, how we expect the 2021 budget to end at June 30th. So you'll see the revenues coming in at about 97.9 million. And then you'll see our expenses projected to come in roughly around $92.3 million. And I'll go over fund balance in the next slide. And you'll see that revenues over expenditures is about 5.7 million in excess revenues. So when we look over from the projection column, you'll begin to see the 2021-22 column. Right now, the long-range budget in terms of our revenue picture is projecting an overall revenue picture at $98.199 million, which is a 0.23% increase over our adopted budget. The tax levy, I do want to point out on top, and I can go through that a little bit deeper in a moment. Our tax levy, using the assumptions that we have right now, are calculated at about $83.66 million, or a 0.09% increase in the cap over last year. Our CPI for property tax cap calculation purposes came in at 1.23%. Again, another year under the 2%. So when they say property tax cap is really not a 2% cap, it truly is not a 2% cap. So advocacy efforts still continue. again this year to make the minimum a 2% cap truly. But we haven't seen legislation passed yet. It is something we'll keep an eye on as we move forward over the next 2 months in budget development. And then you'll see our other revenues listed below. And then you go down to our expenses, and you'll start to see with our expenses, and in the chart I presented to the board in hard copy has some considerations to the right of it of what we would need to do to make this a balanced budget. At this point, this is our projections based on the data that we have today from a state aid perspective, comparing it against our own data on our projections and what we've actualized in revenue, as well as expenditures for this year, what our historical numbers have looked like is taken into consideration. When we look at our expenses in 2021, 2022, I do have to say what we took our current district operation and our budget from this year, from 2021, and moved it forward for 21, 22. And what we increased was our contractual obligations. So our union agreement salary increases, which are determined, our retirement contributions, and our other contractual obligations is what was increased to arrive at a projected long-range expense side budget for next year. All other object codes in terms of supplies or materials or other contractual items that are not necessarily either legally or contractually bound were left at 0% over the 2021 school year. So with that said, taking our current district operation budget moving forward and increasing those mandated or contractually obligated increases moving forward. Right now, our expense for next year shows at just about $99.4 million, which does show a $1.2 million deficit at this point for next year's fiscal year. And I do have to say, I feel very confident in the numbers that we've projected at this point, both on the revenue and on the expense side. The analysis performed showed that we were very close in terms of our projected revenue for 2021, and using those comparisons and our strategy moving forward for 21, 22. The wait and see now is to see what the state budget and what school aid actually looks like for next year, and talk about what a year. We lived through a pandemic for the last year and a half, and we were here a year ago at this time looking at long-range financial and trying all the way through budget development in the middle of a pandemic, trying to estimate what the 2021 school year would look like. And here we are, in another year. And pandemic aside, the really questionable aspect is the support that we'll receive as part of our school aid package, and what advocacy efforts will drive some legislation that benefits public schools and or negates some of the governor's proposals that would have an adverse impact on our budgets. So that's where the wait and see game kind of lies in terms of what our actual picture will look like for next year. Of course, salary and benefits really end up being the largest part of our budget. And then when you continue to look into the 3 outer years, we continue to show 22, 23, and then 23, 24. If we continue to take what we're doing today, moving forward into those outer years before we get into budget development for 21, 22 and make deliberate decisions of what our adopted 21, 22 budget looks like, this is what this picture shows. And we show 2 more years of projected deficits based on the data we have today. And then in the 24-25 school year is when we start to show a positive position in terms of being out of a projected deficit. And you'll see as you look through the expenses that are listed at the left and you look across the years, our salaries go up by the contractual expenditures, but pretty much outside of equipment, projected for this year, our numbers stay pretty consistent. You know, it looks pretty normalized going across the next 4 years. I will say, as part of our assumptions, as Dr. Pritchard mentioned a moment ago, and certainly, you know, as we move forward in summer project development and also budget development, and receiving more guidance from the board, the transfer to capital in terms of how much we want to budget, whether it's the $1,750,000 or up to the $2 million, you know, that'll be part of the budget development and summer work planning and decision making. But right now, this picture does include $2 million towards those efforts.
Mrs. Coster, may I interrupt, please?
Sure.
So one of the items, a couple items I think that you've mentioned that bear some additional emphasis for folks who may be watching at home. This is our initial foray into analyzing these assumptions, or making these assumptions. These assumptions are consistent with our past past performance, past behaviors, and there's very little variance between actual and forecasted. So we have good history here. So these are, while these are good numbers, they are conservative numbers, and we do have to show a deficit as part of sort of this initial conversation. We're not going to have a deficit, but we have to state that up front, given that we are making some standard roll forward assumptions. So clearly, in order for us to address at least on that revenue versus expenditures, we're showing a $1.2 million deficit, revenues less than expenditures. Obviously, we would never allow that to happen. In order for us to address that, my first question as superintendent is, I always ask, my first question of Mrs. Coster is, what is the deficit? Because we're always going to have a deficit when we make these forecasts. That's the first question I ask. A 1.2 million, 1.5 million deficit is manageable from the perspective of cost containment strategies that we intend to deploy and intend to discuss with you as part of budget development. We're going to consider things like demographics and program needs, as well as reduced enrollments. But a reduction of that deficit would bring down our total budget to budget increase. And one of the call outs that you don't see in this particular slide that you did see in your packet on Friday, you'll see a call out there that shows what those goalposts might look like under a scenario where we do not have a deficit, where we reduce expenditures by 1.2 million. And I think that looks, you know, and again, I don't have it in front of me, but we're talking about a 1.6% budget to budget increase. So those would be really what I would recommend to the Board of Education would be our goalposts. The year-to-year increase in spending is going to be somewhere between, my recommendation would be somewhere between 1.6% increase budget to budget, and then what you see there on the screen as a 2.65% as the high end and a 1.6 on the low end. But again, there's going to be more assumptions that are going to be needed to be made, as Mrs. Coster suggested. We're going to see we're going to have an improved revenue picture as we start moving into the spring. So again, this is a very rough draft in terms of what those projections might be. Also, I would direct your attention, I know Mrs. Coster suggested some how we use fund balance equity and how we distribute that. I want to show you, Mrs. Coster, if you can just point out it looks like about an $18 million capital reserve.
And I actually have that in detail on the next slide, Dr. Pritchard, so.
And I think that will ultimately lead us into our conversation tonight about summer capital project work. So that's a fairly large number that I think we need to consider. But again, everything ties together. This is algebra. And, none of these variables exist unto themselves. One impacts on the other. So I just thought those were points that I think needed to be emphasized. So Mrs. Coster, I appreciate you're giving me the opportunity to kind of make those illustrations. So please continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pritchard. So as Dr. Pritchard mentioned, it is off to the right. One of the other considerations that we'll wait and knowing the history with the governor's timeline in terms of budget. And I don't think, hopefully what we see and what we've seen in prior years is that usually the March proposal is a lot more improved than the January. So when Dr. Pritchard mentions those goalposts, that's one determinant on the goalpost, right? To have that balanced budget. So to be up in that 2.6 goalpost, that really means that more revenue needs to come in and lower that $1.2 million deficit. On the other side, it's kind of this balancing act. Otherwise, we look for ways for cost containment strategies and to lower on the expense side. So that's there, and we'll see what they do. As Ms. Lee mentioned, a lot of the advocacy around is one, we really need those federal dollars to support the state budget. Of concern, and this is something we'll review a little bit more in detail at the Audit and Finance Committee tomorrow night, is for all of us to be aware that it's COVID was this unique circumstance that I don't think any of us have ever been through, and it's really shaken all of our worlds. And obviously New York State is in a deficit, but in terms of how he develops a budget for school aid to infuse these what could be one-shot federal dollars to supplant doing a reduction from state funded monies and replacing those with federal monies to support school aid is a trend that we don't want to see continue. One, because it's relying on those acts of Congress to pass these one-shot revenue dollars to a state budget coming in. So what we've seen in this January executive proposal is similar to the original CARES Act to cover expenses from last spring. They show the reduction on the state budget side and then offset that reduction dollar for dollar with those original CARES Act federal dollars. Well, that is the same methodology is being used in the current executive proposal. So it's just something for us to keep an eye on. And as different advocacy groups go out, that's not really a trend that we want to see the state relying on those federal dollars to make up the state's commitment towards funding public education K through 12. So that was another insight on there. I won't spend too much time on this chart on the bottom because we have our fund balance on this chart, which basically takes it year from year, where we project to be at the end of 2021 at the bottom of the screen, and how we would distribute that estimated 5.7 million. And then it carries it through each year for the next 4 years after that. But what I'd like to do is just switch to the fund balance slide.
Before you go to the other slide, I just have a question.
Sure.
You have two lines
Mhm.
for transfer to capital fund.
Yeah.
On the previous slide. Yeah, you have transfer to capital fund and then tax levy impact. And then you have transfer to capital fund, and there's nothing on that line. And then down below you have capital reserve.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between capital fund, tax levy impact, capital fund, and capital reserve?
So the transfer to capital for the tax levy impact, those are monies that are budgeted in the general fund budget on the expense side that go to support capital projects. And so when the voters are essentially voting on the entire budget, if it ends up being 98.1 million, whatever it ends up being, that's including the authorization to take the 1,750,000 or the 2 million and actually record it in the capital fund, that all the expenses for, say, the summer work projects would be recorded in the capital fund of our finances and not directly in the general fund. It also does become a part of our capital exclusion factor for our property tax cap. So for any projects by regs, we submit to State Education Department for building aid purposes, and of which we would file final cost project reports. It requires us to include it in as a capital expense, part of our levy calculation, but it's essentially voted on by our voters as part of our budget. And then that gives us the authorization to track those expenditures in the capital fund. Transfer to capital fund, honestly, like that's a line for internal, so that it would be if we did in phase 2B and phase 2C as an example of our current capital work that we're finishing. If the voters approved, which they did in our last project, to pull money from capital reserves into our budget to pay for capital work happening, it's more of an internal accounting entry. The capital reserve money first flows into general fund, and then an accounting entry sets up that funding from the capital reserve in a capital fund coded to whatever project that was approved. So that line is usually left for internal accounting entries from reserve monies coming into our budget and then being tracked in the capital fund. I should actually probably take that off of there. It was left on there because our actual 2019, 2020 numbers are included on this spreadsheet. But as we move forward, I could take that line out. And then on the bottom is all of our total fund balance. That's our reserves, and also our monies to account for our encumbrance carryovers at year end, as well as the 4% unrestricted we're allowed to keep as going into next year. So the bottom is just our total fund balance between our reserves, the 4%, and our encumbrance carryover monies into the following fiscal year. And that's why with fund balance, I always like to go to the next one to kind of show it separately. But this sheet was just assigned to show our total, to include our total fund equity as part of our picture.
Alicia, if I can ask
Sure.
a couple other questions. One, mentioned earlier that we're going to be reviewing this at Finance Council. Will we be bringing more information as far as what specific assumptions were used to build this model up?
Yes, definitely, Dan. What I'll do, and I'm probably going to email, I wanted to wait through the board meeting tonight, and then I'm going to email the Audit and Finance Committee in the morning.
Perfect.
And that assumption sheet along with that.
So with that, I'll save a lot of my questions till tomorrow, but just to me, probably what feels like one of the most important questions is what's the point of view on state aid? Right? Obviously, in light of the deficit, what we've heard in the past, it's gone back and forth, but here we are essentially holding state aid flat over the term, except for the outer year. I would like to understand why we think it's going to go up so much in the outer year, but that's what's actually saving the results in the outer year. But in reality, just curious, what's the basis for feeling comfortable about being able to preserve state aid?
So we, obviously we were conservative in the approach. We have, I would say right now, based on the state budget and what we're hearing, it's about a $500,000 swing right now between what we're projecting to get and where we think the state may be. So that's a really tight number this year. Couple big things that impacted this, which we were hoping based on our assumptions, it didn't happen in the later years, especially 24, 25. Foundation aid was frozen at 1920 levels. That's the biggest portion of our state aid, as well as with them trying to collapse down to the expense-based aids year to year. It affected us overall, only about 30,000 we're estimating. But as a state budget, it was actually cut by just under $400 million when you do an apples to apples comparison. So there's some couple big hits here. And then with property tax cap for us, which is the largest part of our revenue stream, having a 1.23% CPI. And now once again, we have another
Sure.
fiscal year where it's under. So we kind of kept it flat, not knowing the affairs of things. One of the things that was clear in the governor's address was that we're probably looking at the year 23, 24 before the economy is considered fully recovered out of the pandemic. So trying to hold it fairly flat, but yet still trying to reflect on the expense side unless the decisions change our strategy going for budget development for next year, our contractual commitments and our current district operation, without cost saving strategies, our expense still continues to grow, but really across, we stay relatively flat in terms of our state aid. Property tax cap, again, goes back up into the normal 2 ranges that we're used to, but we just don't know what's going to happen in terms of they're going to make any changes to the cap yet.
Understood on the cap, but I mean, I'm just thinking about, obviously it's come and gone as far as the risk on state aid, but this is clearly an area that, is riddled with risk and could come in with a sizable reduction. And we would be materially looking for changes to the budget.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, through the address, they really, caveated a lot of the numbers that came out that this is contingent upon that $6 billion.
Yeah.
The state is still looking at a $15 billion deficit. So a lot of right now.
At one point, there were a lot of discussion about, what was it, a 20% possible reduction?
So that was the little bit of good news we're hearing is for this year's aid that they're going to release the 20% withholding, but there's going to be a 5% reduction from this year's aid, which is about $666,000 for us estimate.
Still a big number, but a lot better than 20%.
Absolutely. I think, Mr. Lamadrid, that was the bright spot out of the entire executive proposal.
We should just, I mean, obviously, as we go through budgeting and planning, right? I mean, whether it's just the next couple months or even probably the next 12 months, right? This is truly the time for flexible budgeting. And even when we think we have a budget, we have to be regularly prepared that there will be, things out of our control that will force us, whether it's unfunded mandates, that we're not even considering for COVID response, or it's a material reduction in state aid, and we're going to have to be able to revisit it. So, okay. So appreciate that. And I'll take the relative good news as you said it. And then, so I'll save my assumption questions for tomorrow, but then I would suggest again, it's a lifetime away. You're looking 5 years from now, but the increase in state aid in your outer year, which I think at this point may not be appropriate. I think it's better to just keep it flat throughout, but that would negate the surplus that we have in the outer year. It's symbolic, and doing anything 5 years from now, but it just seemed odd to me that we have such an increase in state aid.
No, agreed, Mr. Lamadrid, and I can't stress enough, and I appreciate your feedback because, we thought last year's long range into budget development was an uncertain world. This is a very uncertain world right now. And, I would totally agree that from now till the budget's adopted and even after, we're going to have to keep a really, really close eye on our financial affairs. Because I just think overall our world just in general has been so impacted and right now trying to draw a straight line through this and sort of put the pandemic on the side and plan financially. I think we still have to keep in the back of our mind that none of us, including the federal, the state, local, has an idea of truly what the impacts of COVID are on us. And it's probably going to be a year or so before we really fully realize that impact from the pandemic. So we will be keeping a very close eye. And at the end of this, I'll kind of just give our next steps as an administrative team, where the activities that we've been having and the conversations that we've been having and kind of next steps on that. And I can look to run some different scenarios for audit and finance for tomorrow too, and definitely get their feedback. We have a bunch of financial experts on that committee, so I value their input as well. So with fund balance, this is our end of January fund balance analysis of where we project to be at June 30th. You can see that we began July 1st, 2020 with about a just under $2 million fund balance. Again, our projected revenues for 2021 and our expenditures are carried forward into this sheet. And you can see the 97.9 for revenue and the 92.2 for our expenditures, brings it to a 5.7 excess. And as you look down, a couple things, information that's coming the board's way. You'll first see our reserves. So you can see where we were at July 1st, 2020 for our reserve accounts. Any expenditures out of those reserves. Revenues is basically our distribution of interest on our reserve monies. And then where we'd like to see ourselves in terms of, if I just take there without any other distribution, that's what June 30th, 2021 would look like. The next column was my estimate on if we had 5.7, how would we distribute it? With our tax certiorari, I had a meeting with Mark Scharf last week and the town assessor, and we kind of went through our current status. We do this every year. It's a couple-hour meeting, and we go through all of our tax certiораries and the status in an effort to definitely project out our liability and to compare that against the tax certiorari reserve to make sure that we're fully funding up to the level of what our projected liability could be. So there is an updated memo and sheet coming to the board this week. Mr. Scharf said he'd be sending it our way for the board's attention. So I will forward that. The good news is that his sheet was a little bit higher. It was at about $7.6 million in liability. But given the pandemic, there are petitions on there where the Rockland County judge has not called any conferences for the parties to meet to try to settle out some of these petitions. So there are two very big ones that we believe are closed. So when you see the $7.2 million tax certiorari reserve, that is after this meeting, that's where we feel our liability is going to be. But the sheet that you'll receive may just be a little bit higher because they're waiting for conferences to officially close out and settle out some of these petitions. So most of our reserves are fully funded at this point. That's why you don't see a distribution into the other accounts. So the balance of the fund balance was put to the capital reserve for now, if this turns out to be a real picture. And as Dr. Pritchard mentioned in the beginning, that would give our capital reserve at just over 18 million. So that's the top is our reserves. And then of course we see the normal, we see our reserve for our encumbrances. And we usually book about $1 million and we'll usually come under that. And then our 4% adjustment. So we had, as of July 1st, 2020, our 4% was 3.873 million. And I'm projected out with a fund balance 4% of 3.927 million. And in the board's materials, that 3.927 million is based on the fact that we cut $1.2 million in expense out of next year's budget. So when we predict what our 4% is, by law, we are allowed to keep 4% of what next year's budget amount is. So that 3.927 fund balance 4% number is based on a budget that's $1.2 million less in expense than what's currently projected. I just want to make sure I put that out there right now. So that 4% obviously is going to change as we get into budget development. But for this projection, this is where we stand. And then we end up in this picture at June 30th, 2021, with a total fund balance of $33.9 million. So this is based on what we know today. The good news is, in a very uncertain world, thank God we have the reserves to cover potential liabilities and even unexpected emergencies that could come up in the future. So it's really, as we continue to have financial discussions, it's really important that we are cognizant of our reserve balances because they're critical for our long-term stability to be able to access to. That's where that stands. I'm not going to go all through this. I just, every year, and of course, this will be in the long range books that'll go out. But for 21, 2021, 2022, our growth factor, you'll see at the top, went up a little bit, and that's determined by the Commissioner of Tax and Finance. You see our prior year capital debt service and our capital tax levy is deducted from the current year tax cap calculation. Again, you know, in 2021, we had a 1.81% CPI used for the calculation. For 21-22, we're at 1.23%. You know, last year's property tax cap was at 2.82%. This year, we're projected at 0.09% based on these figures. And then part of the calculation is taking what amounts to our net difference between our expense for debt service and capital levy expense minus our aid is what's factored into this calculation. So again, we go from 1920, we're at about a 3.83% increase. 2021, a 2.82% cap. 2021, we're projected at 0.09%. And then you'll start to see in the outer 3 years, we start to, based on these numbers, go up to 2.95, 2.35, and so on. And again, that's based on the numbers we have today, based on some of the assumptions we're making. And one of those is that the $1,750,000 went to the $2 million. It also assumes that CPI will return to 2% starting in 2022, moving forward into the outer years. So again, the tax cap assumes some things. It assumes a return to 2%. It assumes our building aid analysis stays consistent. We've reviewed that several times in depth. Our BOCES we have not gotten what their capital exclusion is for certain projects that we as a component school district help pay for. We do not have updated figures from BOCES yet on that. So the $108,432 was still factored in and carried forward as part of our capital exclusion. So there are some assumptions that I've listed on the bottom that are factored into this calculation. So hopefully more information in terms of BOCES and decisions regarding summer work, and potentially if we decided to use capital reserve money, this may adjust further before the March 1st deadline for tax cap. Now aside, you know, you'll see this more in depth in the long range books, but another side of the financial plan and making decisions in single year budget development are what our enrollment trends are looking like. First, based on our demographers report. And I do want to say that in a long range plan, right, long range planning, for the most part, we're looking up here with what the demographer gives us in terms of analyzing our data, as well as live birth rates and a whole other slew of demographic information. That's what we use for our long range plan. And obviously when we are in budget development for the single year and working with our building principals, we're taking our data, knowing what our actual enrollment is, how many students are attending at each grade level, how many sections, how many teachers. We dive much deeper into what our enrollment is looking like for next year to align to our programmatic needs and then measure it against our staffing needs for next year. So we're going to be going a lot more in depth with that, which we've already began that process with our administrative staff. So one of the things, and Mr. LaMadrid, it may have been you a while back, or maybe Mr. Jacobs, some of the ideas to definitely take a look at when we're looking for cost containment strategies. One of the biggest things is our class size guidelines. These guidelines have been in place a number of years. And as we move along, you know, we as a team will make decisions of, you know, do you open another section if you're expecting, you know, 1 or 2 more students above the guidelines? How many more students above the guidelines? What's the financial impact? So we will do that as a team and bring our recommendations to the board for consideration. But we've had these guidelines for a number of years. So you'll see regular ed on the top, and then you'll see special education at the bottom. So when you see some of the charts, I'm going to give you a taste this evening, and then in your long range books, know that our demographer also takes our class size guidelines when they'll do the analysis against projected enrollment of what we could potentially go down in the number of sections we're running at each grade level. So based on this year's update, I wanted to start here. First, you'll see actuals for 5 years to the left of the screen, and then you'll see projected out for the next 5 years, beginning with 2021-22. And this is without, we average between 60 and about 61 moving forward of students that are in out of district placements. This enrollment analysis is only our K through 12 students attending our 4 schools. It does not include out of district placements. And it's quite noticeable. And we've seen this, right? We've seen coming into 2021, we had a total decrease in K through 12 at 132 students. This is based on beds day information that was done in October. It's one of the data points that our demographer will use. And then you'll see how they projected forward. So each year there's some kind of decline over the next 5 years based on this. And this chart goes to 25-26. And we end up with a K through 12 enrollment of 2,657 students. So keep that in mind. And then when you look at this chart 10 years out, you know, we still see a projected decline in enrollment from 2026-27, where you see 2,598 students out for the 5 years. So in 2030-31, which is I know is a long time off from here, it's about 2,500 students that we're looking at. And we know that a lot can change from in here, and it's just one data set to kind of take a look at as we begin conversations. So as much as when we enter, you know, our budget development discussions for a single year budget, you know, it's those financial parameters and financial analyses to keep in consideration, but we also are taking a hard look at our projected enrollment in comparison to what we're actually seeing in the classroom. And this year, basically the virtual and the in-person classroom, but total student population going into next year. The pandemic with the enrollment, you know, we had worked with the demographer. I think we're probably a year or 2 out before we see if there's any true impact from COVID. We know what we've seen coming in the door. And this year, seeing that decline at about the 132 students, it kind of lowered some of our original projections. So our registrations this summer just reduced what we thought our original decline would be for this year, but it's still a decline. So that's another indicator that we'll keep in mind as we have those discussions. And so that was the financials. Some of the things that we are, there we go. We're doing, we began our meetings with our principals. One of the biggest things we start them with is taking a look. We send them their staffing and section reports, and they're the same reports that we provide to the Board of Education as part of long range using demographers. And then as we move through budget development. So we'll have some very in-depth meetings with each building principal and each director on their staffing, as well as their other projected expenditures. As cabinet, we've already started to meet about budget, looking at program, looking at, which is a tough area this year for Dr. Tessick, trying to estimate what special education and what those services look like for next year is also a big number. And then, you know, with George, technology, you know, what are the lessons learned during a pandemic this year, as well as Dr. Collot. What have we learned this year that we want to take into consideration for our program, our use of technology, our use of resources for next year? So as a cabinet, we're having those discussions. And then it's a process, right? So we keep meeting, we give, you know, we'll provide the board updates, receive your feedback and direction and parameters, and then we'll see what the state budget does. But I very much agree with what Mr. La Madrid said. This is a process that we're gonna have to keep a keen eye on all the way through. Like, I'm sorry, like this is a year where it doesn't end at budget adoption, just like last year. I think when we implement a budget next year, whatever that budget may look like, we're still going to be looking at how we're spending our dollars and watching it very mindfully. We've averaged about a 3.1 budget, 3.2, 2.8. Now we're looking at much lower than that, possibly under twos. So we'll keep you posted as far as how budget is progressing. I will say that, so we have audit and finance tomorrow. We'll continue to seek input from our audit and finance members on our financial picture and recommendations for budget for next year. The long-range strategic books to the board, we'll have that out to the board members the first week in February. So you'll have our long-range plans and all the long-range information that you normally receive in your books the first week in February. So we can, if any questions or anything come out at that time regarding long range, any one of us would be happy to answer any questions the board may have after you've had a chance to review your books. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Dr. Pritchard for any questions or the next part of our workshop.
So before we proceed, I just want to say thanks, Mrs. Coster. I think that was an excellent overview. And I do think we identified some of the key features of the budget, as well as the sort of the environmental considerations that we're going to be faced with as we start to make decisions as to how we deal with scarce resources and unlimited wants over the next few weeks and months. But I can say truthfully that I've seen, I've been involved in public education now and doing budgeting now for quite some time, and we've seen at periods of time where we've been faced with sort of these economic challenges. And I think that, I don't know, maybe Dan said it earlier, or maybe it was Lonnie. I saw a head shake there, but, I've seen worse. It's not going to be easy by any stretch, but it's manageable. And I think it's going to require that we make some smart choices. And there's some opportunities there to do some really interesting things, I think. I like this idea of flexible budgeting as it relates to, and I think it'll manifest somewhere in how we manage fund balance, specifically as it relates to capital project development. And we've already gotten some really good insight from the board, some critical insight, and we're hoping we're going to get some more of that tonight as we continue our conversation about projects. But before I segue there, is there any other final points that the board would like to make as it relates? I know we spent a little bit more time on that than we had wanted to, but I don't regret that. I think there's some good points that were made tonight. But I'll defer to the board on that matter if there's anything further we want to contribute. Knowing that we're going to spend a lot of time on this in the next few weeks ahead. So we expect that Mrs. Coster, I think the date of adoption, at least our first attempt at adoption from the board is sometime in April. I know it's specified on our official calendar. So, given the fact that, we're looking at the development phase of the budget, we have a few weeks ahead to kind of have those considerations. So what I would like to do is, if we can defer that conversation to Finance Committee, because I know they're going to want to have they're going to have some conversations about this. If we can put together, or if at least next board, what I think we should do going forward as we plan out our board meeting agendas for the next, until we get to adoption, we should have some conversation about where we're at with the development at each board meeting going forward, so we can at least track our progress. But I think we're in a good place, at least in terms of timing. I think our as I started the conversation earlier, I think our assumptions are good. Obviously, time will tell. But we've had a pretty good track record in terms of making those forecasts. Those variances have not been large. So, and if anything, we've erred on the side of caution. So So I have no reason to suspect that that won't be the case this year as well.
Absolutely.
So, Mrs. Coster, time being the issue here, I know you have a discussion protocol as it relates to summer 2022 capital project work. So I'll let you proceed.
Thank you, Dr. Pritchard. So part 2, summer work planning 22. And I emailed this protocol this evening. I realized it was the lateness of the hour. You may not have seen this on your email, but for purposes, and I think Dr. Pritchard said this at the December board retreat, we want to be very respectful of the board's time and your time to have discussion and review. So on behalf of Dr. Pritchard and the cabinet team here, we're going to be better listeners than talkers this evening. And so we wanted to have a protocol that just really walked us through the summer spreadsheet. And I will say the summer spreadsheet that you received, and I will put it on the screen, is the same items that we looked at the board retreat in December. No new items were added to this sheet. You'll see that I just recategorized it to clarify what work was actually selected for summer of 2021 and what was not, and then left the items for summer 2022 on there so we can walk through that. So just to review the protocol, and again, we'll try to obviously cut it down with the lateness of the hour. What it'll look like, everyone received the copy of the milestone schedule, and we kind of did an incorporated one that kind of fell in a chronological order, as well as the summer spreadsheets. So Dr. Kalat has offered to be the timekeeper. And first part of this in task A, because we really want to hear your ideas, your understanding, your thoughts, and your perspective on summer work. And this planning would be for summer of 2022. And that was on our timeline. Our first task is to take about 10 to 15 minutes, and we'll let each board member on their own take a look at the spreadsheets. And if there's one or more items that really jump off the page to you that we really should consider for summer of 2022, we want you to kind of circle that and think about why that item's meaningful to you. And then at the end, we're going to ask each board member to kind of share your thoughts on the items. And we're all going to listen. And at the end of each board member proposing one or more items, we're going to let the other 4 board members kind of respond to those items. And then the board member presenting will kind of just have the final word on the feedback once they've had a chance to listen to the other board members. So we'll do this round robin all the way through task A, B, and then our closing, we'll just closing thoughts and any next steps for about the last 5 minutes. So we'll see how it goes, but we want to give you a chance first, review the spreadsheets, identify items that jump off the page that are a priority for you. You're going to report out to the board. Each board member will kind of give feedback on those items. We'll all listen, and the board member presenting will kind of just have the final word on any thoughts that they want to share based on hearing the rest of the board members. Us as a cabinet, on behalf of Dr. Tessick, Mr. Brady, Dr. Lloyd, Brian Kalat, Dr. Kalat, Dr. Pritchard, if there's any clarifying things, we'll help with that. But we really do want to just take down notes and hear your perspective for summer of 2022. So with that, what I'd like to do is shift and just put up, can everybody see that okay, the milestone schedule? Okay, so really in gold is our dates. So what we thought, and please, as a Board of Education, if you'd like to see us as the administrative team take any different steps, please let us know. But we have on the schedule 2 facilities committee meetings coming up, one on the 2nd and one on the 9th. And we set those meetings up that we want to take the board's input and feedback and bring that to the facilities committee. And in addition to the board's thoughts, get their input, and hopefully by the meeting on the 9th, come up with a tentative recommendation for the board's consideration and come back to you with that recommendation for review and discussion at the February 25th meeting. To keep with our timeline, we would need final approval for summer of 2022 work at the March 11th meeting. So we have some time. We have time to go through this process. But if you'd like to see anything in addition to the facilities committee and review, please let us know. And we'll certainly adapt kind of our work plan, getting to that March 11th meeting for board approval. So with that, Brian, are you ready for the clock? I'm going to put up the spreadsheet.
Yeah, so just my job as a timekeeper really is just to keep us on task and to make sure that everybody has a chance to speak. And the first 10 minutes of this is really just to give everyone a chance to kind of go through the list. And as Alicia said, anything that jumps off the page that we think is a priority, you'll have an opportunity to kind of talk about that and why it, you know, is a priority for you.
Yeah, and I won't keep on this screen, you know, your first sheet was summer of work selected, and you can see the items there. They were all high priority, estimated costs there, a lot of electrical work and bathrooms. And then on here, on your sheet, you have scopes of work that were originally projected under summer of 2021 for consideration that weren't selected. So like you have, you know, classrooms at Schaefer, the high school auditorium. So those are up for consideration. And then you also have the original summer of 2022 with the same items that you saw in December. And again, you know, it has the rationale for performing the work, the benefit to students, an estimated cost, and whether it could be completed in 1 year or not. I will send a clarifying point of information. There are 1 or 2 items on the summer of 2022 list that cannot be completed in one summer. So it doesn't mean it's off the list, but it could be something that begins in summer of 2022 and then continues the summer into 2023. And then what I left on here is, however summer of 2022 looks, we do have $1 million in smart bonds monies that we can leverage for summer of 2022 work or beyond. And hopefully the pandemic's gone and the board's reviewing. So we should be able to hit that milestone in terms of a timeline. So unless there's any clarifying questions, I'm going to ask Brian to start the clock and let each group have a chance to review their sheet.
Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, okay. So before we begin, just to go back to the protocol, and you don't need to pull it up again, Alicia, it's also an opportunity, once you pick an item or a few items that you want to discuss, to obviously ask questions that you might have about these items, whether it's questions about cost, whether it's questions about timeline. So it will be a discussion. So with that, if no one has questions, can we take 10 minutes to kind of go through the list, take a highlighter or whatever, and just tick off the things in each school that you feel we should discuss?
So just for clarity, we're doing this independently now.
Yes. I just want to let everyone know we're about 5 minutes into it, so about another 5 minutes to just go through the lists. And for anyone who's watching, Alicia's also scrolling through some of the items on the screen.
Thanks, Brian.
And just if the public's watching too, all of these items are part of our district master plan as well. Here.
So Brian, what if we're done? What if we're ahead of schedule? It's nice to have the 10 minutes, but if we can, keep things up, it might be worth to ask if
Good.
people need more time.
Anybody need any more time?
I have a thumbs up for,
Yeah, that's fine. If everybody's had enough time to go through all 4 schools and pick a few items, then Alicia can facilitate
that's
discussion.
what I did to be fair. And so I put all the board members' name on a slip of piece of paper, mix it up, toss it around. And I'm literally just gonna pick one blind to begin. So I have Tom. So Tom, you are the lucky first as the board member. Kind of talk about the items you picked and the why. And if, as Brian mentioned before, if you have any questions or, would like more information, we'll begin with you.
Okay. So based upon pictures that have been provided to the facilities committee, some of the classrooms at William O. Schaefer, to me, look like they're in dire need of upgrade and renovation. Whether it's floors, ceilings, lighting. The ones that have already been renovated look beautiful, so it would be nice to get those other classrooms up to speed. The other thing that Lonnie and I heard through many of our visits to the school were complaints about bathrooms. Existing bathrooms are not nice, and there's not enough bathrooms. So between just at a high level, and I would say William O. Schaefer classrooms and then bathrooms throughout the district. The one other thing that I want to point out is in the auditorium, the sound system leaves a lot to be desired. I've attended several plays where the sound just cuts out, and it's a terrible disservice to the very talented students who are singing and performing. So at a minimum, the sound system needs to be upgraded there. I wanted to emphasize why I didn't pick the locker rooms, even though it's ranked high. During the facilities meetings, the original estimate was $3 million cost plus 1.5 for overages. And we asked Lou Rodriguez if students would use them based upon his experience. And he said no. Students do not shower these days. So I just don't think that we're going to get the return on investment for that particular item. So Schaefer classrooms, bathrooms throughout the district, sound in the auditorium, TZ auditorium are what I focused on.
So now what I'd like to do, and Christine, you're the first board member I see on my screen. So just in a little less than a minute, just feedback, and Tom and the rest of us are just going to listen to your thoughts on Tom's selection, and then we'll move. The next person on my screen is Kara. So Kara will be after Christine.
Okay, so I completely agree with what Tom says about the classrooms. I feel like that's where, if you think about student and student impact, that's where you get the most visual, visible, and I think the most important impact. My only concern with that is that pretty much meets the entire $2 million. If $2 million is the amount, then that pretty much, is the scope for the summer of 2022. So, that would be my one concern. As far as the speaker system, for the high school, I thought that was covered in 21.
That is the middle school. Did the middle.
Oh, okay, so you're talking about the high school. Okay, so that wasn't on the list, right? Unless I missed a list.
It was on the summer 2021 not selected, the second page.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's a full renovation, and what I think I heard Tom say was just minimally, the sound needs to be addressed at the auditorium.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, so that's my feedback on that. I mean, the bathrooms, I agree with you on that, but I'm just doing a numbers game, and 2 million is 2 million, and we're talking now about another 6.
Would the 2 million actually be cut in half?
Another million.
So it's 2 million, so we have about 24 rooms. Obviously, these are high level estimates.
No, but is it 2 million per year, or is it 1 million per year?
Nope, it's 2 million
That's for the
first
school.
half, and then it's 2 million for the second half. So this would be an example of work that would go into summer of 2023 potentially. Obviously, we hope estimates would come in a lot tighter, but this was just taken from the high level number we heard it in facilities originally. So
And can you clarify that? Was that 2 million each summer?
it
Or
is.
2 million? So
Yeah.
you're talking $4 million to do 12 rooms?
Yeah, and that's a high level estimate. That's taking what they had projected on there. There's about 24. All right, so Christine, okay. Kara?
I don't see how you could spend $4 million in 12 rooms. That's
No.
my personal opinion.
Yeah, I think it'll come in a lot lower. Kara, do you have feedback for Tom's recommendations?
Yeah, I also agree that the classroom renovations is number one for me. It has the most direct impact on instruction. I think that all the data that shows that how your physical space impacts your learning, I think is just it just jumps as the most important thing on this list. I understand the bathrooms too. But I was thinking that the second thing that I think is most important is the lockdown system for the lower grades. I don't think that, we can discount the world that we live in right now. And that safety at the lower schools, I think is definitely a high priority. And I think that Tom's point of the PA system is also really a good point. And I wonder if that at a minimum is something that could be pulled out of that much bigger project and focused on.
Okay, Lonnie, and again, each board member we're gonna move to each board member's prioritize items and receive feedback. So Lonnie, do you have feedback on Tom's selections?
I have feedback on Tom's selections, some of which I'll get when I'm given the opportunity to speak about my selections. Just hearing, $4 million for 12 classrooms, and you believe that the numbers are going to come in a lot less. I just have some trouble determining a list if we don't have accurate numbers. I'll speak more to the classrooms at William O. Schaefer when I'm given the opportunity. That was one of the things that I, circled, as well as the TZ High School auditorium. I circled as well. So I guess I'll need more than a minute to elaborate upon my comments and my thoughts on those items.
We'll definitely get more than a minute.
Right. That was Lonnie. Okay. And then Dan?
So I think for me on Tom's list, great recommendations. I think with 2 million to spend, we are unfortunately making severe trade-offs on what we can afford. And I think, while it pains me to say it, doing something that is closest to instruction, we just can't afford it at 4 million, right? I think what we'll see, and I'll elaborate more on my points, is there's too much infrastructural needs of the district, and I think that has to be the priority in the near term. But the bathrooms and other things that I'll share, I agree with Tom on, absolutely.
Okay. And just, let's see, Brian, how are we doing on time? 9:10. What I want to do is have the next board member go, and just remind, we're taking all these notes. This is, I can prep the architects. We'll go to facilities, and then we're going to keep coming back to you before we would ask for final approval of anything in March. So we'll drill this down and get specifics as we move along in the process. And Lonnie, you're board number 2. And here's my sticky. So can you see it?
I was going to say you're going to need more than a sticky for my comments. So just to begin with, along Dan's comment that, we can't spend, $2 million, because that's what we've got. I think we're shortchanging ourselves to only be focusing on 2021 and 2022, looking at the value of some of these projects. If the intent of the board and the district is to carry $1,750,000, $2 million in the general fund going forward as we did, then there should be no reason why we can't look at 2022 and split projects into 2023 some work.
Yep.
And then, along those lines, and I'll take William O'Shafer, as an example. First of all, the $2 million for the 12 classrooms, I thought was a lot of money. Now I'm hearing it's $4 million for the 12 classrooms, which is just, I can't fathom it. I can't understand how we're going to spend, almost $400,000 renovating a classroom when we're talking about some new tile, painting and ceilings. So I really need that number looked at, and we really need to drill down and get a more accurate number of what it will cost to renovate a classroom. And then, with regard to that, I don't understand why we would have to do it all in 1 year and take the $2 million we have allocated and place it in one building in one task. So I would say that, I agree with, Mr. Henry, that we should be looking at the William O'Shafer classrooms, but I also think we should be looking at it in terms of a phased program where we can do a couple of classrooms a year over a course of maybe 3 summers and do it so that we're touching, that building, but we're also touching the other buildings and we're touching other students, throughout the district rather than just a focused group of students. And then similarly, the same thing with the auditorium at the high school, that line item, the $1.5 million wasn't on any list, right? It missed the summer of 2021, and then it also missed the summer of 22 work. And my thought there is, as well, is, $1.5 million, is such a large percentage of the value that we have to offer, in year to year, that we should really look at those items and see how we can phase those items in a thoughtful process where, maybe we can do the sound 1 year, we can do the reading another year, and again, spread it out over a couple of summers and touch, the high school as well as, the other buildings as well. No one spoke about the lease of the modular library at Cottage Lane Elementary School. And, just looking at that, to purchases is $119,000 and the 1 year lease is $21,000. So in 6 years, if we continue to lease it, we bought it. So does it look to, renegotiate that lease in terms of a lease purchase option. And then, if we were to purchase it, what's the salvage value on it or auction? And what is the prognosis? If we're going to wind up, not addressing that, that space for 3 to 4 years, then in 3 to 4 years, we're going to be paying, 3/4 of the value of it. Does it pay to buy it and salvage it? We should look at that in terms of some sort of analysis rather than to just blindly say we're going to continue leasing it. And before we know it, we've leased it for 5 years and we could have bought it and, been done with it. So I would say that. But, I guess one of the biggest, comments I have to it is when we have these larger dollar values that would consume so much of our $1,750,000 or $2 million, we really need to look at how we can phase this work and develop a scope that's a component of it that becomes more manageable. And then, no different than we're looking at our long range master plan, and we're looking for a phasing system, phase systematic, thought process to go through it all, that we do the same here with the summer work. I don't think it's an all or nothing on some of these items that we should be looking at. And then I guess the last comment I have is on the smart bond. Similarly, we've got a large ticket item on the video camera system, district wide, and the voice over IP phone system. I don't know how old our current phone system is, and $1 million on the video cameras and the interior exterior wireless access control, again, seems to me like a lot of money to spend there.
Yeah.
That we might be better off looking at doing some of the clocks and the PA speakers under the smart bond money, which then puts more money available that's closer to the students.
Mhm.
So I tried to speak fast to get it all in under the timeline. I don't know if I was successful.
Did great.
Thank you. And so we're gonna give, let's see, did we make it? And Dan, no, Dan went. We got everybody? Losing track. Yeah.
So now everyone has a minute to respond to Lonnie's comments.
All right, I've got to pick. All right, let me shake these up more.
Or in reverse order or whatever.
I'd say, apologize to the Karen, Christine. Dan, you are next board member on your items.
On my items, or am I responding to Lonnie's?
On your items, we're going to move to your items, right? Did we?
I'm sorry. No, everyone's going to respond to what Lonnie said.
Yes, thank
You
you.
get an opportunity to rebut my comments.
Yes. We're not moving to your items yet, Dan, but you can respond to Lonnie's. And look, I mean, some of you may have the same priorities, and that's great, but I think someone made the point that we want to make sure that we're looking at all 4 schools too. So
Yeah.
So Lonnie was very efficient with his time management, and he has a lot of points to rebut. So I'm not gonna go point for point. I will say I do really appreciate Lonnie's, I think, primary point is how do we spread the work out so that we can not consume the entire funds on one initiative, right? So that could apply to auditoriums, classrooms, bathrooms, right? So this way you could see progress, right? Because we need to do it all, right? At some point, right? In a lot of these areas, and we're going to very quickly, we all know we can't do it all right away. So how do we how do we move everything forward that needs to be moving forward? Because you can cycle through a bathroom renovation. You don't have to do every single bathroom in a building at once. You don't have to do every single classroom. So I do like that concept of thoughtfully, right? Not losing the synergies, but thoughtfully figuring out how we can spread items out so that we can be tackling multiple projects within a constrained time period.
And then let's see, and then we grabbed, and Kara, everyone gave feedback. Tom went. Lonnie, and those were did you have, before I go forward, sorry, let's track. Lonnie, did you have additional items besides what you reported out on that were part of your initial analysis, just to take a step back? I want to make sure we covered everything that you had taken a look at before we.
As I said, I looked at the clocks and the PA systems in the schools, and as Dan brought up, the bathrooms again, My biggest comment is, as Dan identified, is that, we need to be careful with the larger value items, that they don't consume, this, significant portion of the annual allocation, that we can't do anything else. So bathrooms need to be done. We've done a lot of bathrooms. So, where's the next bathroom to get done? I would say it's a function of, where's the oldest bathroom? I'll go back to what we saw in the facilities, committee, where, we had the age of the unit ventilators put on a drawing that, basically, as I said before, creates a roadmap as to, where you have to focus your efforts first. I would do the same thing with the bathrooms. I do the same thing with the classrooms. Create, a defensible logic, that we can systematically address what we need to address. We don't just haphazardly choose bathrooms in one building or class. Why are we choosing the classrooms we're choosing William O'Shea for this year or next year? Because we like them, or they're the oldest classrooms and they're in the worst condition, or they're adjoining classrooms, so we get synergy from doing it. But I think that's the approach we have to look at in terms of deciding how to choose the work in a systematic fashion. That, again, knowing, as far as my point of view is, we're going to have the $1,750,000, $2 million a year, in the general fund, that we can plan this work out, in concert with the long range plan. Right. I mean, one's not independent to the other, but, if we know what we're going to be doing here and, with our, general fund money, then we also know how it impacts and relates to the long range plan.
Thanks, Lonnie. And while we're doing, the next person to go was Kara. With your items, if you had additional items, different items.
Yeah, I don't have additional items. I am always appreciative of Lonnie's comments. And I, splitting the work up, moving past the summer of 2022 makes so much sense. My only thought, and I'm sure, and I have confidence that this is being managed, is that if you do break up projects, like if you say we'll do some bathrooms one summer and then some bathrooms another summer, or whatever the project is that to be mindful of the cost savings that could potentially be lost by not doing all like items at the same time, if that's a potential. But I do still feel that the closest to the students is best. And so the classroom renovations would be my number one project. But agreed that spreading it out over multiple summers would make the most sense within the budget.
Thank you, Kara. And as you can see, as we've gone around, and I'm going to go to Christine, is that, all the board members are for the most part in sync with the items that you're identifying for a priority. So we're seeing a common theme across the identified items and the feedback so far. So we're kind of jumping a little bit because I don't want to make you repeat yourself by sticking exactly to the protocol. And Christine, to you, is there items that you identified as part of your priority list that may not have been mentioned tonight, or any other feedback you want to give as well?
Yeah, so a couple of things. The clock PA system, as Kara had mentioned previously, for William O'Shea and Cottage Lane. I think not only that's important from a safety factor, but also from a consistency factor, because 21, this summer we're doing Tappan Zee and Soames. And so I think it's important to have all four buildings up to speed with, with that important safety factor. I also had, the second thing I had was, I also had the same question for particularly some of the items like the smoke detector, fire systems, emergency doors and exit lights, if it's still functioning, because I did see under the comments that some of them is at the end of the useful life. But if it's still functional, because end of life to me means something different than still functioning, then I think that would also help with the priority. My third and last comment is, I understand that we're going to do the capital reserve for 2 million, but if the work is a priority and it can be done in whichever building, all 4 buildings, next summer, I think we need to present that to see if it's 4 million or 10 million, whatever the number is. And I guess that really moves into the long range, capital plan. I don't want to lose sight of, we had done all this work. We were talking about 60 million and 90 million. I'm not saying we should be moving forward with 60 or 90 million by any means, but, and I understand we want to make sure we carve it out into buckets, affordable buckets of 1.75 or 2 million. But if it's a priority and it needs to be done, then I think that also needs to be part of the conversation. So I'm a little hesitant to just restrict ourselves to 2 million.
Okay, so at this point, and Brian, we're doing okay with time, right? We've managed to go through the protocol. Applause to our Board of Education. You moved through the tasks in your own items and feedback to one another, and it really identified a common theme. And I just, for purposes of time,
you're doing okay on time. So far, Lonnie and Tom have been able to present, and I guess Christine, was that your feedback for Lonnie and also the things that you wanted to discuss? So do we want to give feedback?
And Kara gave feedback. Was there anything that a board member didn't get a chance to give a feedback of based on the other board members' items? Or are you feeling good about your items and the feedback that you've presented on what the other board members have?
I have a question.
Sure, Tom.
It goes back to the William L. Schaefer classrooms. How many classrooms in total are we talking about? Is it 12 or 24?
I'm going to check because I thought there was almost 24, but I will verify that before facilities. I thought that Lauren had mentioned in one of our meetings that she had told us at one point there was 23, but I will go back and count that with her. And I think just like some of the other items, it depends when you start looking at, what exactly needs to be done in each classroom, or what exactly needs to be done, as Christine remember, exterior doors, interior doors. When we do that analysis deeper to see what exactly needs to be done in each space, it may look a little bit different per classroom. But to Lonnie's point, if I took an average of $200,000 general per classroom, and if it was 12, it'd be about 2.4 on average. So I thought it was closer to 23, but I will verify that, Tom.
So now, we've already renovated some of the classrooms. Can't we use the cost figures from actual work to estimate this work?
Yep. So I had looked at that with Lauren initially. A lot of the classrooms that we've done have been done with our in-house projects. So, the floors, the ceiling, the light, the painting, the general stuff, we've been able to do for under that 200,000, I think, but some have abatement issues that need to be done. Other classrooms don't need to be abated. And in a lot of those classrooms, we didn't remove the older AC units. So that has to be taken into consideration. So okay. I can definitely have Lou and both Lauren look at that a little bit deeper and provide that information to them. And I think, just the notes that I've written down just as a consensus from the board. So I was just busy listening and writing as the board was talking. I'm hearing that, and it's a question back to the board. We have February 2nd coming up for facilities. I'm hearing that it may be more advantageous for the facilities starting with year 2022, matching our long year financial and matching our master plan, go out 5 years, 2022, possibly out 3 to 5 years from there, look at a prioritized work from what the board mentioned tonight and then input from the facilities committee, and provide the board with a recommendation of a 3 to 5 year plan with this phasing these scopes of work out. With Lauren and Lou giving us a little bit better of an estimate of what that scope of work would be on an annual basis. We have a meeting on February 2nd. We have a meeting on February 9th. The goal of the facilities committee was to come back to the board on that February 25th meeting. With the board, is it more advantageous? And I think I heard the answer tonight, to come back to the board on February 25th with a 3 to 5 year plan for summer work, with better detail on the scope, the age of either a classroom, the bathrooms, and some of the equipment, closer estimate, and then a rationale as to why certain groups of work were staged together in a particular summer versus another, and present that to the board on February 25th for further consideration before we would ask for any type of approvals, at least to move into summer 2022. Because I think, back to Christine's point and all the board members' points, is that as we're going, and this was done intentionally, right, to match up these conversations with long-range financial and budget development. So any conversations that have a financial impact from a facilities end are also taking into consideration our financial plan. So to talk about any use of reserve, it might be advantageous to have that 3 to 5 year work plan, as Lonnie mentioned, come back to you, and then considerations, whether it's $1,750,000 to $2 million each year, or potentially the use of capital reserve and what that would look like. Would that be our next step through facilities, and then plan to come back to you on February 25th with that 3 to 5 year plan for your consideration and further direction, and then move from there after that point?
My only question would be, is what's the value or consideration of capital reserve we would consider? Are we talking about, $2 or $3 million from the capital reserve, or $5 to $10 million from the capital reserve?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, if we keep, and that's a point of conversation once we have, I think, the values. The good thing about, we'll keep in mind too, is with the capital reserve, knowing what we're projected to be, it's kind of in and out. You could consider a one-time authorization from the voters in May, but that it's left to like an up to amount like we've done previously. And then it could be over 3 years, it could be over 5 years. What we've done with the current capital project, I think we had up to a $9.8 million authorization to access the capital reserve, but we pulled out as actual expense hit, and we needed it each fiscal year. So that's something that we could consider again. Here, this summer work on this spreadsheet, I think we were trying to keep it within the $1,750,000 to $2 million. And I think, Dr. Pritchard, I think we had recommended at December up to like a $6 million capital reserve access, I think is what we had presented in December.
Yeah, at our last workshop, we were considering and again, nothing more than a nice round number of 10 million. We were looking at 2, 2, and 4. I'm sorry, 2, 2, and 6, excuse me. So that was just looking at it from the context of a $10 million total as it related to drawing on the capital reserve. So that may be adequate. I think once we've had some more conversations about what that value will follow the work that we want to do. Certainly, I think this evening's conversation is going to guide that.
Lonnie, if I could maybe respond to your question a little differently. Appreciate Dr. Pritchard, round numbers as a target, but frankly, what I think might be helpful is as we look at these lists, what's clear is, and it's not all infrastructure, but we have a lot of deferred infrastructure items that have to get done or will be preventing us from doing other next level work until we get the infrastructure needs done. So I would perhaps ask the facilities committee to kind of recommend what are all the, what I would consider required infrastructure needs of the district, whether it's these electrical upgrades, transformers, bathrooms, and it's the stuff that, I'm bracketing these words, has to get done.
Yeah.
Right. And then if you laid that out, Lonnie, and said, okay, that equaled $8 million, whatever, $7 million, right? Because what I think has to happen, I think we have to get past this deferred maintenance that we haven't been able to get past yet, because then we're going to be constantly, well, you can only do this many bathrooms. We're never going to, you can only do part of the auditorium. We're never going to get to the really impactful stuff that's going to touch the classrooms, that's going to touch curriculum. You know, we got to get there as quickly as possible. So I would be very eager to see what is that required, and I'm underscoring required, right? And then we should have a conversation about, you know, could we get that done and accelerating that, and how do we use capital reserve? I think that to me would be a way to approach how much we would want to unlock capital reserve. And also, frankly, it accelerates our ability to go to next. We have to get past the infrastructure so we can start talking about what is next gen classroom, next gen technologies, but we can't do it because we have more bathrooms that are so outdated than we even know we can even count. So again, that's just my recommendation, Lonnie.
I think that's a great guiding principle. I was just looking at it arithmetically. So again, but I think that's a great guiding principle, that when we look at the that amount that we tap the capital reserve, we bring back to facilities this idea that that's going to be it's going to be multi-year. It's going to be one voter, as Alicia mentioned, one voter authorization. I think also it'll certainly consider Mrs. Lee's comments about not losing sight of those capital improvements. And I think deferred maintenance as sort of a foundational element to that work, I think is a great guiding principle. So we'll move forward with no objection from the other board members. I think that's a great way to move forward.
But I still have a question in terms of utilization of the capital reserve. I mean, we just saw earlier, you know, there's a anticipation of, you know, after June of 2021, roughly $18 million in the capital reserve, right? So, you know, as a board, do we want to put some parameters that, yeah, you want to go after the deferred maintenance and so forth, but you only want to use 25 or 30% or 40% of the capital reserve?
For myself personally, just one person's opinion, I'd want to see what that number adds up to, right? Required maintenance, right? And I'll leave it to the facilities experts to define what required means. But what are the things that have to get done? Because otherwise we're never going to get to the next level of investments into the district. And is that 4 million or is it 20? I mean, I have no idea. We should talk about it. And because based on the size and scope, you know, we could accelerate it or spread it out, right? So I don't know, Lonnie, that I would restrict it yet, right? And this is not, I mean, and again, I'm specifically underscoring required. This is not, sorry, this is not the auditorium. The auditorium, right, you know, sound system we could say is required, but you know, $1 million renovation of the auditorium is not required, right? It's those things behind the scenes that absolutely have to get done because we're not going to be able to address, you know, whatever it is, ventilation issues, technology issues. It's all the stuff behind the scenes.
I think you said, Mr. Lamadrid and Mr. Jacobs before, and maybe other board members, let the dollars follow the information on the work first, and let's see what it comes to. And the more and more I think out loud, and Lonnie, I think you first approached facilities committee meetings this way, is what is the work for the next 5 years? Required infrastructure, maintenance items, and then what are those programmatic items to include, right? And they're not always mutually exclusive, but I get your point, Dan, like there are some things, like there's electric work we have to do this summer because there's things we can't do until that's done. And we've spent 2 years now on master planning. So having those conversations with the building principals and all the studies and all the reviews of these spaces, we can organize that together and come up with a 5-year spreadsheet for the board's consideration, and then have a little bit tighter on the estimates, knowing that whatever we select, those estimates will get even finer once we know exactly what needs to be done in each space or each thing, and then it goes out to bid. So I'd rather, if anything, be a little higher and it comes in lower, wonderful. And there might even be items we say, look, it's a priority, but you know what? Our district's own maintenance crew can do some of this work over the next 5 years. And we've done a lot of in-house work. So we're about to close out for purposes getting the last of the contracts for phase 2C closed out. So once that's done, we'll see what our final balance is for phase 1 and phase 2 work. I will tell you, we are under budget. So our fund balance going back to capital reserve does not include right now any monies that may be left over from phase 1, phase 2 work. So I'll have a better estimate at the end of the month too, that we can bring back for February 25th for considerations at that time of leveraging the capital reserve and budget for this 5-year capital work plan. And I like what Lonnie said before. I think having our architect color code the age of our HVAC equipment was very, very helpful to see the ages in the buildings. So I'll ask them to see how far they can go with classrooms and bathrooms. I will say, Tom started out in the beginning of the meeting with classrooms. Schaefer one, it was a couple of your points as an example was they are some that are still in the worst condition. They require abatement. There's economies of scale to take a wing of classrooms and abate them at the same time and get it done. But there's other areas that we can consider. And, you know, Brian's been looking at spaces. So I think all of your points tonight are well taken and very much appreciated, because I think I agree. I think we need to look beyond next summer. And we're glad to hear that feedback from the board on this. And we'll take it back. We have 2 meetings. The facilities committee graciously added a meeting on February 9th, an additional one. And we still have our audit and finance committee to leverage too as we move along with this. So is there anything else with cabinet members? I know you've been actively listening. Is there anything? I just want to give our cabinet members a moment if there was any input or any feedback before we close this protocol. I'm sorry.
No, I just had a couple of other questions. I didn't make a comment before about what Lonnie said about the library. I think that I just want to reiterate, I do agree that's important to understand that, because you know, we built it really well, strong foundation. So I think we need to take a look at you know, what it would take to purchase that.
I'll reach out and I'll send you guys I said it in December where we kind of stood with the options. I will call and kind of see where they're at, negotiate with them a little bit, and I'll bring back that information.
Okay.
For 25th.
Yeah, and then yeah, also Alicia, you mentioned the, you know, some work that can be done internally by our own staff. So I like what Dan said about, you know, creating this analysis, but I think we also need to add another column in there saying, well, these items, you know, our maintenance items, they need to be done, and they're going to be done internally in summer of 2021, summer of 22, and so forth and so on, so that you deduct that from the overall scope. The last question I have is there any potential risk to, you know, what we might be hearing from the state as far as changes to state aid? And if so, you know, I think that's a question to our architects, if they have some insight into that. And if that could also be embedded into our prioritization. So for example, if, you know, emergency, you know, systems, there's a rumor that state aid's going to go away, we should do that now before the state aid goes away. So I want to make sure that we have insight into that.
I do have a little bit of good news that I didn't share with the board, and you just reminded me, Christine, our aid ratio. It's actually,
yeah, went up.
We're, yep, the 37.1 to 38.3 next year.
Yeah. And then later on, could we also get a status of where the design work is going? Because at the last meeting, we did give the go ahead. So they had said it would take 4 weeks. We are, you know, close to that 4 weeks, I think now. So if you can let us know where we are with that.
Absolutely.
That's it.
Just further to those comments. I know you sent us the information on the modular unit at Cottage Lane, but you know, the financial aspect is only one picture, one component of it. We really need to know what are the district plans. if the district's not planning to do anything with it within the next 3 years or, 4 years or 2 years, or they need it for the next, 2 to 3 years, we as a board, don't have that insight. So, the financial information is only one component of what's really needed to evaluate, what to do with the modular unit.
I could just share, and I think
And you-
the library is definitely, I think, a well-made building. I think it exceeded all of our expectations. I certainly didn't expect it to come out the way that it did. It's used all the time by kids. And so I think the discussions at facilities, as well as with the administration and teachers, is that, we definitely need the library long-term. And whether or not we purchase the existing one or we replace it with something, we would not want to see that structure go away.
Can I put it even more simply? So every one of our facilities should have, must have a media center, because that really is our tie to or projecting the work going forward. And the only way I would ever recommend not having that space would be to replace it with a brick and mortar space. And I'm not seeing that as necessary, based on what I see in terms instructionally happening in that space. I agree with Brian. It's exceeded our expectations. So I would be reluctant to get rid of that space in favor of, like I say, a de novo brick and mortar space. I think the functionality that is there, I would not recommend. Let me phrase it more positively. I would recommend purchasing that, or lease to purchase agreement before that. I think it makes sense financially, but I think programmatically as well.
I think if we were.
I guess the question is programmatically is, over the next 3 to 5 years, do you see us creating space in Cottage Lane within the existing walls of Cottage Lane to, provide that space? Or do you feel that in the next 3 to 5 years, we're not going to be able to create that space within the existing walls, and therefore we're going to need it?
I would agree with the latter, Lonnie. I think that regardless of how enrollment trends, now that we have the space and we see the difference between having the library media center where it is separate as opposed to converting classrooms, and then potentially running into the same situation, 10, 15 years down the road, where we're closing the library to accommodate additional classrooms. So I would say we're going to need it for the long term.
Yeah. And I know that the similar vein was when I met with the principal and their leadership team way back during master planning. I think the master plan was going to take 2 of the largest classrooms if we wanted it internally. Otherwise, to get rid of the modular, I know that they were advocating for the visionary addition to the building. So just with the projected enrollment, I don't think we're seeing enough of a drop to justify taking away instructional classrooms within the context of the footprint for the short term. And I agree with Dr. Collot. And if we took existing footprint right now, we're potentially putting ourselves in the same boat where we're going to be in need of classrooms in the future, hopefully. So I would agree, but we could include that in there. I know it was something we reviewed at facilities, even just to put the notes as to why we arrived at keeping the modular building with the updated financial information and bring it back. But I'm glad it was brought up tonight. Like I said, I left it on the sheet because I just did not want it to fall off of our radar, knowing that the original lease was up this July. So I'll give them a call and I may even put it in a board report early, some of this information back to the board with an update on summer 2021 submittals, as well as the modular library as soon as I get it, instead of waiting until the next time we meet on this. So we'll work on that as well. And then I think like another consideration too is that we'll dive a little bit deeper into the high school. I know the high school was sort of a monster footprint to look at in facilities. We had originally sort of did a phased approach to addressing the needs at the high school. So we'll see, we'll talk about it in facilities, but just how to maybe tackle the high school over the next couple of years as well. Some of that wasn't put on the spreadsheet because it was, at the time, the scope was a little bit more massive than looking at 2 summers worth of work. So we can revisit that in facilities too. And I think the ages of things will definitely help on the concept plans. And it's a good visual with the plan for us to bring back to the board as well. So you have the visual, plus you have the spreadsheet information to consider. And like I said, we have, by that schedule, trying to keep us very early and at least getting the summer of 2022 approved as part of this larger plan would be the March 11th board meeting. So we have a little bit of time to kind of finalize that 5-year plan and then say, as a board, are you okay with summer of 2022 work, so that we can keep the timeline going, so we're prepared to file to the state, receive approval, bid, and have shovels in the ground ready for summer of 2023. So that's kind of our immediate goal right now, but we'll certainly come back with all this information. I took down a lot of notes this evening, and I think we got our marching orders leaving here. Is there anything else?
We have our marching orders. I think you've done an amazing job, and the board has as well as the cabinet, in terms of itemization.
Yeah.
One thing that fell off, and you mentioned this, and I think Mr. Jacobs actually heard us have this conversation. I can't remember exactly what the venue is, but I want to memorialize it now. We've reviewed scope probably ad nauseum in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
However, there was one item that fell off, and I'll defer to Dr. Tessick on this. The one piece strategically that we had considered in terms of a long range connecting, our long range facilities plan to our strategic plan was the idea of providing student supports at the high school.
Convention center.
And we had considered at one point, and I don't know what happened. So I got, again, it's all of our corporate memory here. So I got to throw it out, which was this idea of creating a space at the high school that was more, it was more student friendly, but more centered on, having more of a student focus, sort of a cohesive approach to providing student supports, and a reconfiguration of the main office, looking at more of a provision of wraparound services for students at the high school, so we don't have to trace a kid who's in crisis. We're traipsing that person all over the high school looking for an office for that. And I know I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I do know that at one point we had designed that space, but for whatever reason, probably because we can't do everything all at once. But I know that was something that I would never introduce without having board visibility or sort of a board awareness on that. So when that comes to fruition, how that gets incorporated into our long range facilities plan, I don't think we should be talking about that tonight, obviously, but I don't want that to fall off our radar, because I do think it's important.
Absolutely. Bob,
Can I just add?
Oh, sure. Sorry, Tom.
So we're talking about where the vice principals currently reside?
Correct. Moving. So looking at the space, the idea was to move the assistant principals into what's currently the guidance, school counseling, the long, narrow offices, and putting the prevention in that space.
Can we move the guidance counselors and the psychologists to the assistant principals and move the assistant principals to the guidance without doing a major renovation?
I think it may go back. I was thinking, just reflecting on what was said tonight, and I think it goes back to what Lonnie said, looking at, right, because that was tied to that move, so that we had the counseling in the assistant principal's office, and then at some point, maybe updating the way that what would be the new AP office flowed with the principal's office and the main entrance with security. That certainly could give a phased approach. And I think the assistant principals would kill me for saying this right now, but I'm going to say it. If we can get Karen and I, when we both took these positions in our first year as part of Karen's long range plan, had incorporated the prevention model for both the middle school and the high school into this plan, along with the staffing and the supports that went through it. I think getting that space done is more important. And if the administrators lived in the existing counseling space as is, we could certainly do that. It's a functional space. It's not something that it has to be tomorrow and updated, but we could do that aspect, the prevention center, and then shift everybody. It can be done in phases.
Right, but I'm just thinking, we don't have to spend a ton of money to do it.
No.
And we should do what's in the best interest of the students. So if the assistant principal currently have the nicer dwelling, but that's going to work out better for the students, we should move the guidance counselors and the prevention center there because it's in the best interest of the students.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't think that's a major capital project. I think that's,
Yeah.
We might even be able to do some of that in-house. I know that we do that every year. I mean, as
Yeah, we can take down walls,
Yeah.
put up walls, paint, do all, ceilings, lights, flooring. But I'm looking at Dr. Tessa because she's been very patient this whole evening, listen, and this is one of her heart's passions. So I want to make sure we don't close this evening without Karen getting to speak about this model.
No, thank you for bringing that up. I just think that's critically important to the students at the high school. We see that model and the work that we did at the other buildings has made it a safe place for students who are struggling. And that is an issue still at the high school, that there is no place for them collectively, right? So if you wanted to see a prevention counselor, they have to go down the hallway to the left, to the right, or even to see the social worker. They're very disjointed. And so anything we can do to alleviate that team being so far apart from one another, because it is critical, especially, and it's not just for students in need, but it's also to build up this whole idea of students having a voice, knowing that they can go from the prevention counselor to the guidance counselor and there appears, not just physically, but that there's a connection between those two people. It really builds a support team versus, well, I can go see this person or that person. So thank you for bringing that back up, Dr. Pritchard, because that is something that we've worked on, Val, for 2 years to try to build.
Yeah, and I
But to
think,
Tom's point, we can probably do it rather easy. Yes, in that space. I just don't know how you physically, we would have to look at that space in particular to outdo the offices. And I know Alicia and I started to do that. So
I think that the building administration would be supportive. I don't think they would kill us. As a matter of fact, I think they would be I'm sure they would be very cooperative and anxious to help with the solution. I know we just for whatever reason, it's very easy to I think the first step was to really put the staffing in place, which thank you to the board, you've done that. And now it's just a question of how we deploy them physically. So let's have that conversation. But again, we'll work closely with the building administration. And I do think that's something we probably could at least start that work in-house. So again, I just didn't want it not to have the board's fingerprints on it. Again, because it does connect to our strategic planning. So, and truthfully, beyond that, I can't think of too much else that we haven't really addressed. I mean, that's the thing, there are things that I think are just high end, big ticket that obviously we're going to project out much longer than 2 to 3 years. But that would be one thing that, again, I think needs to kind of be part of our discussion right now as part of this domain. So I appreciate you. I know the hour is late, and I know this is not something that we would want to try to solve tonight, but I think we need to talk about it. I think we need to continue to press for a solution.
Thank you, Dr. Pritchard. Dr. Collette, Mr. Brady, any thoughts, anything else that you'd like to add before we close out this evening?
I was just going to add to what Dr. Tessick said, in that this work has been planned, prior to us creating these positions. We have been able to relocate people in both elementary schools and now at the middle school. The high school, one of the challenges is just logistically with the way that main office is set up, and then goes into an open space where we have some clerical staff and then a long hallway with guidance staff. There's a different number of people in each of the spaces. So it's not just as easy as flip-flopping people, but if we can do it in-house as we've done in some of the other cases, I think it's a priority for us. So
We did it at William O'Shafer.
I'm glad it was brought up. Yep.
We adjusted those spaces. I don't know if we remember that, but that whole configuration of vestibules and student support, we did that over a summer, and I think we did it relatively inexpensively, and it had a tremendous return on that investment. So let's look at that more closely, and then we'll maybe, with the board's permission, we'd like to bring you back. We'll sketch it out and see if this is something that we can offer reasonably within budgetary constraints. But again, I would consider, we've done it in other buildings, and I think that we could most likely come up with a solution that we could do sooner rather than later. So.
And the good thing is, as we move along with this, hopefully we start to hear more about the advocacy efforts and start to see if the stimulus package is passed to the federal government. We'll kind of get a better idea what the state's picture looks like in the next month too. So we'll be able to incorporate those conversations into it. And I'm going to put Dr. Tessick on the spot. I would love if you could attend the facilities committee meetings. I think it'd be important to have you there as we're having these conversations. So
absolutely, just let me know.
Really, really helpful. Thanks, Karen. And we have a lot of fun at night. So Joe, if you're free and you want to attend, we're Zoom right now. We'll take your input as well. And well, thank you, everyone. I'll turn it back over to Dr. Pritchard.
Thanks, Mrs. Costa.
Can I just?
What's that, Mr. Jacobs? It's all yours.
I just want to add one thing. You said that we've got to make our decision by March 11th, and there's a lot of time between now and March 11th. But when you look at it, there's only limited meetings. So it would be nice if we can write down the goals that we need to accomplish at each of the meetings we have between now and then, so that when we have a meeting, we know the purpose of the meeting, the intent of the meeting, and what we really need to accomplish at that meeting in order to stay on schedule. Because I fear if we don't do that, then March 11th will be here before we know it, and we won't be ready.
Agreed. You know what, Lonnie, I think you made this suggestion a long time ago at whatever a committee meeting is. The agenda will start right off with that, and then we'll move right through it. I think you had mentioned that a while ago. I agree. I think that'll be very helpful, and we're going to be in the throes of budget development too. So March is a big window for board discussions and board workshops on budget, and so we need an idea of where we're going and the impact in order to continue our budget discussions in that March window. So, and we may need to have a year where we add a little bit more budget workshops with the board, depending on what comes out of the state and in this environment right now. So I'm sure we might be coming back to the board asking for an extra meeting or two. And we promise not on a Sunday, hopefully time during the week where we can meet again and go over budget. But thank you, everyone. This was extremely valuable. And I hope on behalf of Dr. Pritchard and the team, you found tonight's conversation helpful as well to drive the future conversations. And we'll keep it going between everyone, the board, all the input to hopefully refine a product that really moves us forward in our facilities over the next 5 years. So thank you. Appreciate it.
So thank you, Mrs. Coster. Thank you, team. Mr. Jacobs, that concludes our workshop. And again, I think we have some good direction from the Board of Education going forward. To use the William O'Shafer Student Services or Student Support as an example, I mean, there have been times where we've done a lot of this work and we haven't really synchronized that work with the vision of the board. So I know that, these workshops are sort of an inaugural attempt to incorporate the board's oversight into that work and connecting it to long-range planning. So this is new for us, but I think it's valuable. And again, I think that I'll echo Mrs. Coster's sentiments, which is I think this will pay off for us in a great way moving forward. So we appreciate us using this workshop time for that purpose. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, sir.
I appreciate everybody's time and input. I think it was beneficial, and that the facilities committee, has some work to do ahead of them. And, I think with the clear goals of each meeting will be important to make sure that we focus each meeting on those goals, and that we don't get distracted along the way, so that we can meet the March 11th date. So,
Okay.
any board members have any comments to add or anything? All right. I don't see anybody. So again, I appreciate everybody's time and everybody's input. I think it was truly beneficial.
Thank you. Everyone have a good night.
Let's hope there's no snow tomorrow.